Good morning, girls, and welcome to a class on poetry. This morning, we will be doing one of my very personal favorite poems, Crossing the Bar by Alfred Lord Tennyson. Alfred Lord Tennyson lived from 1809 to 1892, that is, the Victorian age. He is a representative poet of the Victorian age and is, in fact, one of the most famous, if not the most famous, of this era. As I have discussed with you when doing Dover Beach, the Victorian era was riddled with doubts and crises of faith. This poem contains many of the same themes and images that Tennyson has used throughout his works. There is the sea voyage, the solitary sailor or mariner, the patterns and cycle of life and death, and the setting sun. Now, as I've told you before, that it is always beneficial to you to cross-reference when you're doing poetry. So this poem, it combines themes from poems like Ulysses and Tithonus and other poems to provide a final statement about death. In Crossing the Bar, Tennyson expresses optimism because he not only will reach the end, but also he hopes to find what lies beyond. That means God. In Crossing the Bar, he goes for death that is peaceful and natural and a welcome and fitting pause to a life that he has lived well. Now, girls, before we begin with the explanation of the poem or listening to the poem, as you know, the title of the poem is Crossing the Bar. So you must know what is the meaning of bar, what is the significance of the word bar in the title. And in this title, the word bar is used in its nautical term. So what is a bar? Because the whole poem, it hinges on this explanation, on the bar, it plays such an important role. Uh, the sandbar is a ridge of sand. Ridge means a high portion of sand built up by currents along a shore. It is also known as a sandbar or a shoal. It is normally formed near a bay or any area in a sea or a gulf where the levels of the water are lower than the other levels. Now, why are sandbars dangerous? Because sandbars are dangerous for ships and for sailing because these are belly submerged. Okay, and when the tides are low, it is very treacherous because if the ship gets caught on this, then the ships will not be able to move. As you know, that the ship needs high tides and buoyancy to move into the ocean. Okay, so and if by chance the tides are a little low and the ship gets caught on this, then the scraping of the bottom of the ship, it like makes a kind of a sound, moaning sound. Remember this because I'm going to use this a little later on in the poem. Now, especially during Victorian England, sandbars, it had a very bad reputation for seafarers because in those days they were not so technically adept, okay, the ships, and not such engineering marvels, and therefore there would be a lot of death by drowning, by injury. So the bar wasn't just another feature of the sea, and crossing the bar, it wasn't an option, it was a necessity, and you had to cross the bar, the sandbar, to get into the deep ocean, for the ships to sail into the deep ocean. So, 99% of the times they would wait for high tides when the bars would be submerged and then the sailors would set sail. Okay, now this fact is so important because in the poem, when we read the poem, when we explain the poem, when you listen to the poem, you will see that Tennyson, he uses a lot of allegory and metaphors of high tides and low tides. And I've already told you that during the Victorian era, there was a lot of crisis of faith. Okay, so the high tides and the low tides also refers to the highs and the lows of religious faith. Okay, and therefore, this word you will see that how it's very physical. The sandbar is a physical thing because it's something that is present. It's something that has to be crossed. Okay, and yet at the same time, he uses it in a metaphorical way, okay, because allegorically this bar represents the boundary between life and death. I will explain to you how, so don't get confused. The boundary between life and death is represented by this bar, and just like a sandbar forms a gap between the harbor and the sea, the ocean. Okay, the poem suggests that this bar is the ridge, is the barrier between life and death. And this poem is an elegy. It is also a lyrical elegy. It is about death. Now, once you've understood the concept of the sandbar, you look at the picture, you see it is separating the two water bodies. Okay, you're entering from the harbor and then you cross the sandbar, which hopefully is covered by a high tide. Now, this is during low tide, so it is looking, you can see the sand, but during high tide, the sand is submerged, and therefore the ship sails over the sandbar very smoothly into the ocean. And I will explain to you later how he uses this as an allegory, as a metaphor of sailing from life, which is represented by the harbor, into the ocean of death and everlasting immortality of the soul. So as you see, I've already told you a little bit about Tennyson. I've explained to you the concept of the bar. So now I'll tell you a little bit about the poem before we go into a reading of the poem, Crossing the Bar. Now, this poem, it's a very beautiful poem on death, and it was written by Tennyson in 1889 when he was 80 years old. At this time, he was recovering from a serious illness, and he was crossing the Solent from Aldworth to Farringford on the Isle of Wight, which is just off the mainland of England. Okay, and you won't believe that he wrote this poem in 20 minutes flat, and it is said that he wrote it on the back of an envelope. Okay, now Tennyson's old age, because he was 80, as well as the illness that he was recovering from, could have contributed to this beautiful poem and his sort of meditation on death. And now he would want to transit from life to death. And he also requested his son Hallam, who was named after his best friend Arthur Hallam, that this poem should be placed, although he had written some works after this poem, but he requested that this poem, Crossing the Bar, should always be placed at the end of the volumes of his poems, whenever it was published. Okay, now this poem, it contains 4 stanzas, and each stanza is often, the alternating lines are rhyming. Okay, why does he do this? Because it gives us, you see, he's talking about the sea. Okay, it's a metaphor. The poem's a metaphor, and it gives you a feeling of the sound of the coming in and the going out of the tide. Like, for example, but such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. You see that sort of cadence, that up and down, like that wavy kind of movement. Okay, and here he utilizes, as I've told you that the poem is a metaphor, he utilizes an extended metaphor, a metaphor of a sailor who is crossing the sandbar between the harbor and the ocean. Okay, and this represents actually a human being passing from life to his existence beyond death, the passing of the human soul. He begins by, he uses a lot of symbols, so he begins by talking about sunset. Okay, sunset, as you know, is a little before night, sunset, then you go to twilight. So now he begins by talking about sunset. Okay, and he talks about the twilight. And these two, the sunset and the twilight, are actually references to the twilight of his years. You say the sunset of a person's years, the twilight of a person's years. That means now his life is ready to set. Now he is starting on the journey back home to his maker. Okay, so the sunset and the twilight of his life, and the evening star is the star that points the way. Okay, like before, when the sailors, when they would not have, fantastic machinery and stuff like that, they would look to the evening star to uh, to know the direction in which they were going. Okay, so the evening star, and he feels that this is one clear call of death. Death is inevitable, right? And though human beings, we shy away from death, we are afraid of death, yet we know that death is a part of the life cycle. So over here, very beautifully, he explains and he gives us the feeling that he is not afraid of death. He is now ready for death. He is ready to welcome death. And he does not want any crying and weeping and sadness because he has lived his life to the full. Okay, so as I've told you that this poem is a metaphor, and he uses many symbols, and this poem is clearly divided, like, with the words. When we do the explanation of the poem, then you will see, like, he uses the words when, and then may. When is something that puts you absolutely, that this is going to happen, right? And may is something that there is a doubt. It could happen, it could not happen. So he says, when I put out to sea, when I embark, when I have crossed the bar. So these are very emphatic words. When I put out to sea, when I embark, when I've crossed the bar. That means I am going to cross the bar. Sooner or later, I am going to transit from life to death. And then he says, may there be no mourning of the bar. May there be no sadness of farewell. Okay, so then he says that, but this is not something that he is sure of. He does not know whether he will transit smoothly from life to death. He does not know whether people will cry and weep, whether there will be sorrow or sadness. So he's just expressing his wish, but he does not know whether it will be a fact. And then he says, I hope to see my pilot face to face. He does not say when I see my pilot face to face. Okay. So you follow this poem and you will find that there are so many metaphors, like the bar. The bar, as I've already explained to you, the metaphor for a boundary between life and death. Then twilight, you see the gradual progression from twilight to sunset. The twilight representing not only the time of the day, but the end of his life. Okay, and his impending death. Then the pilot is a metaphor that he uses for God, because he believes that, though we are afraid of death, okay, but yet death is something that a person, when he has lived his life and when he has come to terms with his life, looks forward to, because death is something that will eventually take him to his maker. He crosses the sandbar, he gets into the ocean. The ocean represents the soul, eternity, something so vast, something mysterious, something that no matter how much we try to, we cannot understand. And this is where he is going to meet his pilot, that is God. And he also believes, you see, when in the second line he says that, and from out the boundless deep turns again home. So man's life on earth is temporary. We come from our maker, we live our life on earth, and then we go back to our maker. And this is especially important because I told you that Tennyson was living in the times where there was a conflict between religion and science. So over here, he is emphasizing the fact that he believes in God. He believes in his maker. He believes that there is a person, a pilot, who has guided his life and is going to take him safely out from the harbor into the ocean of eternity, where his soul will meet his pilot, his maker, and become one with God. So now listen carefully to this beautiful audio and visual rendering of the poem Crossing the Bar. And after that, we will begin with the explanation of the stanzas.
Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me, and may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea. But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep returns again home. Twilight and evening bell, and after that the dark. And may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. For though from out are born of time and place, the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar.
Now, girls, we come to the explanation of the poem. I'm sure that you must have got an idea by now of the poem after listening to that beautiful poem, after listening to the background, a little bit of the explanation of the poem. So now we begin with stanza 1. I hope you have your textbooks open in front of you. Page 16. Crossing the Bar, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. Sunset and evening star. Over here, sunset, it represents that time of the day when the sun is setting, when the sun is going down, and now twilight and night is going to take over. Darkness is going to begin. Over here, it is symbolic. What is it symbolic for? It is symbolic for the sunset of one's life, the end of one's life. The sun is going down. That means the time is coming for the end of life. Daylight will end and night will begin. And the evening star is the planet Venus. It is seen in the western sky, and normally the evening star is only seen after the sun sets. So sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me. What call? The call of death. And over here, what he's trying to say in these two lines is that a mariner, a sailor, he is about to set out on a voyage at sunset. Okay, the sun now, just try and feel the atmosphere. It is sunset, the sun is setting, and you can see the faint light of the evening star. And over here, the evening star, it acts like a guide, okay, like a light, like a beacon for the sailor. And then the sailor says that he has got the call. What call? He has got the one clear call, and now his ship will sail out of the harbor. As I've told you plenty of times, this is a metaphorical poem. So it is one clear call, is the call of death, and the ship is going to sail out of the harbor of life. And now, before sailing out in the harbor, into the harbor, from the harbor of life into the ocean of eternity, there is still one barrier that he has to cross. And this is the barrier of the sandbar, crossing the bar. As I've already explained to you about the bar is an impediment to a ship crossing smoothly from the harbor into the ocean. Like that over here, the sandbar, the bar that he is talking about, that Tennyson's talking about, is the line between life and death. Okay, so when he says, and may there be no mourning of the bar when I put out to sea. What's he trying to say? He's trying to say that when he moves from the harbor of life into the sea of death, okay, at that time, there shouldn't be any kind of sadness or any kind of complaints about his passing, his death. Okay, he makes references to the sea. Okay, the sea is used as a metaphor for his journey from life into death. Now, as I have picked this particular picture so that you can see the effect. You can see the sandbar just about submerged by the waters. Now, when he talks about in the next stanza about the tide and all that, you will see how important this is, because if the waters are not covering the sandbar enough, then the ship, the boat, is going to graze against the sandbar. Now, this grazing of the sandbar is the metaphor that he uses for mourning of the bar. And what does over here mourning mean? May there be no mourning of the bar over here. Moaning means that long, deep sound, that sound of pain, the sound of suffering, of being unhappy. Okay, so a play on the word M-O-A-N-I-N-G and M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G. No moaning of the bar and no M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, no moaning from family and friends. And may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea. He speaks, so what does he hope for? He speaks for and hopes for a smooth, a gentle crossing from the harbor out into this ocean of vastness, of mystery, okay, when he puts out to sea. And that means he is not afraid of death. At the same time, he does not want his death to be a turbulent one. But see the use of the word, and may there be no moaning of the bar. May. That means it's not something that he can say with certainty. He hopes that the passing will be a clear one, but he cannot emphatically say that his passing will be clear. So that is the first stanza, and you can see how he has brought to mind the smooth transition from life to death, the smooth transition from the harbor out into the sea, from the harbor of life out into the sea of, what should I say, the sea of eternity, the sea where his soul is going to merge with his maker, with his pilot. Okay, his journey to the next world now is going to start. Sunset. See the use of all the words that are used in the stanza. Sunset and evening star. Sunset, now the sunset of his life. So now his journey is going to start at sunset, and he knows what his clear call is. His clear call is that the call of death is the sunset of his life. He's now 80 years old, and he knows that not much time is left, and he has accepted the fact of death. He's not worried about death, but he just hopes and wishes that when he makes this transition, he wants to face death calmly. His only wish is that when his journey starts, there will be no cares, no troubles, no mourning, no sadness. It will just be a smooth transition from life to death. Now, the next stanza, the second stanza we come to, you will find that the metaphor is continued. That of the tide, that of the sea, that of sailing out into the sea. Okay? And but such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam. If you look at the picture, and you can see that the wave at the back of the ship is quite high, but there is no foam. Okay, it looks massive, but it doesn't look very foamy. So, but such a tide as moving seems asleep. Okay, too full for sound and foam. So the idea is of a full tide that suggests that the ship, over here you can see the picture of a ship, but we are talking about the metaphorical ship, the ship of life, that is being sailed in, is in deep water. Why? Because in deep water you will not get too much of foam and fury. Okay, the lack of sound and foam tells us, or rather shows us, that the vessel is in the deep sea. And this in turn suggests that this is not the start of his journey. Now, why is this important? This is not the start of his journey because I've told you at the beginning that he's 80 years old. You see, he starts with sunset. Okay, and a clear call for him. So definitely he's in the deep sea. He is out. He's approaching. He's approaching his death. He's getting ready for death. He's getting for the journey that has already started and will be taking him out very soon, right into the deep. But such a tide is moving. Though the tide is moving, yet the tide seems asleep. So very, very, very deep seas. Too full. There should be no sound. There should be no foam. And this sound and foam signifies the trials, the troubles, and tribulations of life. Okay? And a full tide is suggestive of smoothness. Why? Because if the tide is full, the ship will be carried out into the ocean without any turbulence. It will be a peaceful transition. So the speaker's soul returning to eternity just as on this tide that is powerful and without too much of sound and foam. So you see, this is important when he says that too full for sound and foam, because I had already told you before that at this time Tennyson also was troubled by the thoughts of science and about religion, and how the foundation of religion was being affected. Remember in Dover Beach when Matthew Arnold, when he says that, he is troubled about religion, and he says now the only thing that remains is love. Okay, so like that, Tennyson also, his foundation of religion was shaken a bit. But when we read this poem, we get to know that he recovers his faith, and he wishes for the journey to be smooth, and he wishes to die with his faith intact. That's why he mentions Pilate. Okay. When that which drew from out the boundless deep, boundless, limitless, infinite, without any kind of boundary, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. What is he talking about here? He's talking about the tide, because the whole poem is a metaphor of sea and sailing. Okay, so he's talking about the side, the tide, which is being drawn out into the sea. The sea, the ocean, the sea is a boundless deep, right? Eternal. So, and the tide, which is being drawn out into the sea by the moon when the tide is low. Okay, and then again the same thing. It's a cycle of life. It turns again home. The tide comes back in and fills the harbor and covers the sandbar. So he says that, and over here the boundless deep is referring to the immortal soul. When that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. So this is suggestive that the speaker's soul is returning to his maker. Just as the tide returns to the depths of the ocean. Where does the tide come from? If you have been to a sea coast, and if you have sat and watched and looked out, you will see that the tide is not something that starts at the shore, right? It comes right in from the deep sea. So it comes from the depths of the sea, and then silently, after it comes and reaches the shore, what happens? Again, it goes back into the deep sea. So from that which drew out from the boundless deep, our souls, we are made by God. That was a religious belief. So our souls are fashioned by God. And then we take human form. We live our lives on earth. And when our time on earth is over, we sail away into eternity, and our souls go back. It turns again home. When the tide goes back into the ocean from where it came, our souls go back to the Maker who created us. Have you got that? Have you understood that, children? It's very important, this concept. We believe, that we are made by an Almighty. Our souls are fashioned much before our bodies are fashioned, and our soul permeates the body when we are in the womb. And the soul is something that is constant. The body is just a physical thing which dies, right? But the soul remains. The soul remains, and the soul returns to God. So that, just like the tide which comes out from the depths of the sea, turns again home. And in the process, what happens? When it turns again home, it will cover the sandbar, and it will help Tennyson to make a smooth transition from his life to the ocean, to the sea of death, and to the life of immortality, to be one with his Maker. Time is running out, girls. And so with this, we come to the end of this class, of today's class. But I feel sad because I don't like to break when I'm teaching poetry. You lose that kind of feeling, that thread. But anyway, time does not permit. So we will carry on with stanzas 3 and 4 and complete the poem in the next class. Till then, read it once again, go through the explanation, go through the poem, listen to the poem, and enjoy the poem and try and understand. You're big girls now. Try and understand the depth of the poet's feelings, because death is something that is relevant to us all, to all human beings. And it is something that the young, the old, everybody thinks of. But that is something not to be afraid of. That is something to be accepted. And the sooner we accept it, the happier we will be, because we have to believe in someone out there, somewhere beyond, okay, who is guiding our lives and who is taking care of every move of yours. All you have to do is fall in sync with what God has planned for you. Goodbye, girls. We will meet again in the next class.